So this is our sixth session of Are You Ready to Preserve? Tonight we're going to talk about tomatoes and salsa. The presentations are really two different ones put together in one set. So I assume that everybody here loves tomatoes, and that's certainly, Jersey tomatoes are famous, and we definitely want to have more people enjoy tomatoes, not only in season, but in the off season, thanks to preservation. So quickly, we are Family and Community Health Sciences. We are part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension at the state, which is a unit within the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station at Rutgers. We have 3 statewide departments: FCHS, which Sandra and I are from, Agriculture and Natural Resources. They are the ones who help with our growing of our tomatoes. They work both with homeowners and also our farmers and agricultural producers. 4-H Youth Development works with youth in things like gardening, but also all sorts of science and the arts in clubs and short-term programs and special events. So I encourage you to check out your Cooperative Extension websites for your county. For those of you out of state, I know we have someone from New York. Cooperative Extension runs out of Cornell University in New York and would be part of your looking at a cooperative extension in the county in which you reside, with lots of good resources. We are part of a whole nationwide system out of the United States Department of Agriculture, National Institute for Food and Agriculture. And the good part is that this network of land grant institutions across the country and extensions within those allows us to share resources. So the slides you'll see tonight come out of the University of Georgia's extension system. And it's a great way to get expertise from across the country. And we also, each of us receives support from our county boards of commissioners. Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer. We truly believe in justice for all. We provide all our programming and materials without regard to any status. They're all listed here. And if you feel we're not living up to that, you can definitely reach out through our website to our boss at the state level, and we'd want to know about that. So equal opportunity. So if we were in class, I'd ask you to raise your hands. How many of you think tomatoes are fruit? How many think it's a vegetable? And the answer is, it's a little of both. Botanists classify tomatoes as fruit. And it's interesting when you do a class for children and you ask this question, we'll talk about tomatoes as a vegetable, go up, raise their hand, it's a fruit. So they really do learn their science in school. From the horticulturalist perspective, we talk, and from a culinary perspective, we talk about tomatoes as a vegetable. And that's how I refer to it from a culinary aspect. And apparently in 1893, they took it to the US Supreme Court and they said it is a vegetable. Little trivia for you. Wanted to mention how nutritious tomatoes are. They are low in calories, 15 to 20 calories for half a cup, which is half of a 3-inch tomato. They're a really good source of vitamin C, vitamin A, K. They have potassium and manganese and fiber. They have smaller amounts of vitamin E, B vitamins, especially the thiamine, niacin, B6, and folate. So there's some there, not significant. And even some of the trace minerals like chromium, copper, and manganese. So you really get a lot of variety and nutrients in tomatoes. And the one that's often talked about today is the antioxidant lycopene. It is in the carotenoid family, and it has a number of health benefits for us. Let me get back to my notes. Lycopene, well, let's go to the next slide. It also has potassium and iron, higher in the dried and the canned tomatoes. And iron is more available if it's simmered in a cast iron pot, because the tomatoes leach some of the iron from the pot. And that's, in this case, it's a good thing. So lycopene, it is a phytochemical, a plant chemical naturally occurring. And these antioxidants are good. They help and may reduce our risk of certain cancers, especially prostate, cervix, skin, bladder, breast, lung, and the digestive tract. Research shows that it may lower our risk of coronary artery disease. And an interesting thing about lycopene is it is a fat-soluble nutrient. So adding a little bit of fat to your dish in the same meal or in the same dish improves the absorption of the lycopene. So you might just add a little olive oil, or you might have a little, say, Romano cheese sprinkled on. Both of those are fats, which could help with lycopene absorption. Processed tomato products have 2 to 8 times more lycopene than raw tomatoes. So a cooked tomato product will have more lycopene. And Sandra did a really nice slide for us last year. And so tomato juice, you can see, has 20 milligrams of lycopene. Tomato puree only has 8. Of course, you're not probably using quite as much. Lasagna, 13. So tomato paste, 8. Ketchup, 5 milligrams. So depending on the food, you'll have varying amounts of lycopene. When you're going to purchase your tomatoes, or if you don't grow them, a little bit about this. So a pound of tomatoes is about 3 medium tomatoes. A bushel, which is a very large basket, is 53 to 56 pounds of tomatoes. So if you're doing canning and you're going to your farm market and you want to do a large batch, you might batch of, say, tomato juice or crushed tomatoes, you might buy that bushel of tomatoes. What to look for? You want to look for fruit that is vegetable that's firm, glossy, smooth, and plump. You don't want something that's shriveling because that means it's drying up, it's getting old. It's perfectly fine to buy or use misshapen or that ugly fruit or vegetable because, you know, that's just natural. You don't want to use tomatoes that are soft, bruised, badly cracked, or damaged. And that's especially true when we are preserving food, because food does not improve in preservation. So you really want to use your best quality whenever you're freezing or canning or drying that product. Uncut tomatoes are best left at room temperature for good flavor. Once you cut a tomato or any vegetable or fruit, it needs to be put in the refrigerator. Tomatoes will ripen after they're picked from the vine. When they're shipped, they're not shipped fully ripe because time passes. When we're growing them in our garden, we're very fortunate. We can just go out there and pick them at their peak of ripeness. They ripen best at room temperature, out of direct sunlight. Don't sit them in the sunny window. And you're supposed to put them stem side up. You'll see that a lot online and places, you know, is it stem up or stem down? Experts say stem up. Preserving tomatoes is really easy, and I think this is one of the most frequently preserved vegetables out there. You have 3 choices: freezing, dehydrating, and can in glass jars. We'll talk about all 3 here tonight. So let's start with the easiest, freezing. Freezing tomatoes could not be any easier. First of all, you can freeze tomatoes whole, and when you thaw them, the skins, as they start to thaw, will slip right off. So anyone who makes sauce, you'll see later, you might need to peel the tomatoes first. And Sandra always says she makes her sauce rustic with the tomato skins, and that's good. But many people do want to remove the skins, and it's a lot of work to slip all those skins off to freeze several quarts of tomatoes. So if you have the freezer space, and again, this might be, you know, if you don't have a lot of freezer space, it's not the best method, but I just wash them. I would core the top core at the stem end out, and then I just freeze them in freezer bags. They freeze rock solid, and when it's time to take them out, I just take them out and put them in the refrigerator, and as they start to soften, I'll be able to peel the skins right off without any trouble at all. You may also peel, quarter, or chop tomatoes, whether you skin them or not, that's perfectly up to you. You want to store them, you don't need to blanch them. Those who participated in our freezing, most vegetables have to be blanched in order to have the best quality products, say 6 months from now. That does not seem to be true for tomatoes. So you would just cut them up and put them in your freezer bags, or as you can see here, there's some sauce in a container. Freezer bags really work well. You want to make sure they are freezer weight, not just, everyday weight. The freezer bags are heavier. They are less likely to leak. They will probably keep freezer burn at bay longer. So invest in freezer bags. Plastic containers work. Freezer safe canning jars will work. Those should be the ones that are wide mouth, that don't have the narrow necks. And freezing, by the way, you could freeze the plum tomatoes or table tomatoes, slicing tomatoes. You can freeze cherry or grape tomatoes. The plum tomatoes are more meaty, so they will be good for your sauces and less watery when you thaw them. The slicing tomatoes are going to have a lot more water in them and will be waterier when you thaw them. And of course, you'll never be able to freeze a tomato for throwing it in your salad because they're so high in water, they just collapse when they thaw. You can puree or make your sauce any way you want and freeze it. We're going to talk about some limitations when you can tomatoes, but if you like to make sauce with other vegetables, lots of your own choice of herbs and spices, you are free to do that any way you want without any special recipe and freeze it. Whenever you freeze, do label and date the containers or the bags with what it is. And if you've added other ingredients, like you have peppers in there or onion, put that on there too. I always tell people, and maybe some of you have experienced this, but it all seems so clear when you put that nice container pictured here into the freezer. You go, I'll remember. 6 months from now, you may not, is this just plain tomato or did this have the onion and the garlic in it? Yes, you might know when you thaw it, but in the meantime, it's hard to decide. So always label and date the containers. Oops, wrong direction, sorry. The next method is dehydrating tomatoes. I will remind you that on June 10th, there will be a class dedicated just to dehydration of all foods. But so you know, tomatoes, as I said, are very high in water, so they have a long drying time. The best tomato varieties for drying are plum tomatoes, cherry, or grape tomatoes. A slicing tomato is not going to dry well. It is just so much water, it would take forever, and there's very little pulp there to enjoy later. So these are, sliced in half grape tomatoes all ready for the dehydrator. You're going to want to use an electric dehydrator. Read and follow the directions. They're fairly reasonably priced, probably around $100 or maybe less. In New Jersey, we cannot use the sun. Maybe if someone was on here from New Mexico or Arizona, people dry things in the sun, but we're a high humidity state. An electric dehydrator ensures you're going to have a good quality product. They don't use a lot of electricity. For the most part, they're Not that noisy, you know, it's a hum, but one that most of us can tolerate. But you read the directions and see how to do it. You also can't use your oven because dehydrating requires a very long, low temperature and a fan, which helps speed things. And as you'll see here, the drying time is long. It's not very energy efficient to run your oven like that. Now that I said that, though, if you have an oven that actually in their manual says you may use this for dehydrating, then read and follow those directions. Some ovens do have a very low temperature, some have fans, and may be designed for doing that as well, but most are not. So how do you prepare tomatoes for dehydrating? You were going to slice them if you were going to use whatever kind of tomato, 1/4 to 3/8 inch thick. Grape or cherry tomatoes, generally just cut those in half. The dry time, oh, sorry. Let's try to move my picture, is 6 to 12 hours. Again, lots of time to get all that moisture out. If you were going to stew your tomatoes, you might want to peel them first so that you don't have skins in the stew later, or you could do that rustic sauce that Sandra likes. Here again, you would peel the tomatoes first, slice them 3/4 inch thick, cut your small plum tomatoes just in half, and the dry time would then be 10 to 18 hours. You're going to keep drying them until you can, there's no moisture on the surface and that they're pliable. Okay, so you can bend it back and forth. It's not, you're not looking for something that's like a piece of cardboard, but you're looking for something that'll move but doesn't have moisture. Once you're done, you take those tomatoes and you put them in a tightly sealed jar or container. If you have a lot, you can divide them into a couple jars, and then you're going to let it sit for a couple of days and check them each day. If you start to see moisture on the side of the jar, you need to take them back out of the jar and put them back in the dehydrator. They're not dry enough. If there's no moisture in the jar after, say, 3 days, then they've been dried well, and you can take those out and you can either leave them in that tightly closed jar on the shelf, or you can put them in the freezer and save them that way as well. Why would you dehydrate? It doesn't take up a lot of room. If it's in a jar in your cabinet, you don't have to worry about if the freezer goes out. It changes the taste of the tomatoes somewhat and makes them richer with a more depth of flavor. So that's really nice when you use them at the other end. They're great in sauces. And I know Sandra can maybe say a little bit more later, but she has often roasted her tomatoes first and then she's dried them. So you have that added layer of flavor. But again, follow the directions that are with a dehydrator that you purchase, and you can also find directions on dehydrating from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which I'll mention again later. The third method is canning tomatoes. So I'll just give you the basic 4-step process. Some of you did hear our canning full presentation. But first of all, as we said, you want to start with high quality product. If the tomatoes are starting to turn mushy, you may be able to eat them or use them in your cooking for a meal, but don't use them for your canning. What goes in is not going to improve. So start with high quality. Second, and probably the most important message, is that you need to prepare it according to a tested by a scientific lab or a university method. So you're going to be very specific on following a tested recipe. Sources of recipes, we highly recommend the National Center for Home Food Preservation out of the University of Georgia. They have all sorts of recipes, directions, frequently asked questions. It's a great resource. I would also say that you can go to our state webpage, njaes.rutgers.edu, and then type in the home food preservation, and that page has links to all of the things that we're talking about tonight. It has resources so that you know how to, you can get right to the University of Georgia site. You can get videos, links to webinars, a presentation we did on this topic last year, so you can watch those there. We're going to use canning jars with 2-piece lids. I have a picture of that in a little bit. And we're going to, in canning, it's the heat that destroys the microorganisms and drives the air out of the jar that creates a vacuum seal. So the canning jar is processed in a boiling water bath for a very specific amount of time to ensure that all the microorganisms are destroyed and that all the air is driven out. And that's what the science of those recipes tell you. The canning methods. In canning, we talk about high acid and low acid foods. Tomatoes are smack dab in the middle. They're borderline acidic. And because some tomatoes, varieties, or maybe could be the variety or could be just the canning, the growing season, and the tomato may be a little less acidic, we recommend, and this would be the science, that you acidify all tomato products in order to use a boiling water canner. They also recommend acidifying the tomatoes using a pressure canner. So the variety of the tomato, the growing conditions, the stage of maturity, are they underripe or overripe, all influences acidity. And there is no recommended test for us to do at home to determine whether our tomatoes are acidic enough to use in a boiling water canner without adding more acid. So a couple of things you could do. One is to use some slightly underripe or firm ripe tomatoes, not overripe. As the tomato ripens, it loses acidity. Secondly, the most important thing is to add acid to every tomato product prior to canning. And what you do is you pour directly into the empty jars, either pints or quarts, a specific amount of either lemon juice, the bottled kind that you probably have in your refrigerator, or use citric acid, which is a powder available where they sell canning supplies, and it's very inexpensive. So pints get 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, bottled lemon juice, or a teaspoon of citric acid. Quarts get 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice or half a teaspoon of citric acid. Personally, I always use bottled lemon juice because it's something I have in the house. I don't need to go out and buy something else, so that's what I use. And no, you may not use fresh lemon juice because we are looking for a specific acidity level, and we know that bottled lemon juice is checked to make sure the acidity level is consistent. And so save your fresh lemons for your cooking and use bottled lemon juice in canning. It does not change the taste of the tomato much. I mean, I think that's a concern. If you, it really doesn't make it lemony or citrusy. So if you think it's too tart when you go to use it later on, you could always add a little bit of sugar or some other sweetener, sweet ingredient to offset that tartness. But whenever I've had it, it certainly doesn't affect the flavor at all. Now, this canning method assumes that you are just canning tomatoes. Anytime you have other vegetables, say you have a tomato, pepper, onion, tomato sauce, or you want to add meat, like in a spaghetti sauce with ground turkey or ground beef, you have now made that tomato mixture very low acid, and you will have to use a pressure canner, and I'll talk about that. A couple more things about canning. Here you have the juice coming out of a colander, and so the pulp and the seeds and the skins will stay inside, and you just have the juice into the pot. So canners need to be accurated and operated correctly. That would be applied to pressure canners. We're going to use directions from a reputable source, the USDA, Cooperative Extension, National Center for Food Preservation, or the Ball, which is freshpreserving.com. Ball makes a lot of canning supplies, and I will say they've been in business for over 100 years. So we're confident that and we know they do the research behind the recipes. And this is really important too. Do not use recipes from the internet or family or friends or your grandmother's favorite tomato sauce and just go, I'm going to can this. We don't know if the recipe has not been tested by a good, reliable science lab, they may not be safe. And we know, because we look at those blogs too for professional interest, and there are some bad recommendations out there, bad enough to cause me worry. So please use a tested recipe. You want to make something else, go ahead and freeze it. No worries whatsoever. But canning, you need to follow directions. We do have people on from outside of New Jersey, but altitude affects boiling points for water. And if you are above 1,000 feet, and there are a few spots in New Jersey that are above 1,000 feet, you need to adjust the processing times, which is how long the food in the jars is in the water bath. It's a longer process time. The directions in all of the resources we provide tell you how much to adjust for altitude. You just need to know if you are over 1,000 feet and how much. Again, New Jersey, not so much, very few spots. If you're living up in Vermont, perhaps New York State too, or certainly in the Rocky Mountains, that's a really important step. Jars and lids, you can see jars here. You can see the upper right corner. Those are what we call ring bands. They hold the lids, which is the flat separate piece on the jars. We only recommend using 2-piece canning lids at this point in time. There has not been a lot of research except by the company that makes them for some of those reusable plastic lids. And they are doing some research on that now. I've heard from our extension colleagues, but they're not reusable forever. So more research for the moment. I would highly recommend you get the metal lids, which have a sealing compound on the underside, and they're only used once. The ring bands that hold them on the jars are used forever, or not forever, till they're nicked or scratched. Jars can be used over and over. Make sure they're not scratched or nicked or chipped, then those would no longer be good for canning. We put the hot food in the jars, and then we remove any air bubbles that might be there using a plastic knife or a chopstick, just not metal, because you could crack or chip the glass. You wipe the jar rims clean with a wet, dry cloth or paper towel, and then you put the bands on and tighten them. Oops. So the next step is to put it in the canner. You see a canning pot here. It has a clear lid. The gauge that's up there is, so it's a European model. I don't know how they use it. We don't use it here in the US at all. So you would have 6 inches of water or more in your canning pot at a simmer. You're going to put your jars, first you fill them. You can see the jar below being filled with a big funnel, so you don't make, you keep the rim cleaner. there is what we call head space. So you can see there's space right now from the food to the top of the jar. You want the food to be up probably about 1/2 inch from the top. The recipe will tell you. And when you move the food around with that plastic knife, you might get some more air out, or the food will settle a little bit. So you're going to fill the jar to within about 1/2 inch for tomato products. But again, your jar, the recipe will tell you what that headspace is. Clean the tops, put the lids on. The jars go on a rack in the canner. The rack keeps the jars from sitting on the bottom of the pot. And then you're going to add more water if necessary, so that the water is 1 inch to 2 inches over the top of the jars. And it always helps to have a pot of water or a tea kettle on the stove that's simmering, so you're ready to pour more water into the pot. It's critical that the water be over the top of the jars. Put the lid on, and once the water comes back to a full rolling boil, you start the clock, and that's the time for processing. After the processing, and during that time, do not leave the kitchen. The water has to maintain a steady, full boil. So if you adjust the temperature on your gas or electric stove, do it small increments at a time, because you don't want to lose the boil. Once the time is complete, turn the canner off, take the lid off, and wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. And that's important, because when they test these recipes, they included that 5-minute wait time in the canner before removing the jars in calculating the necessary time. So if you don't do that, then you may not have a safe product. You remove the jars up and out of the canner and put them on a padded surface away from the drafts. I don't have a picture of this, but you need a special jar lifter. It's kind of like a big, I can't think of the right word, clamp to bring the jars up because the water is hot. You're going to leave them cool for 12 to 24 hours. Most of the time, 12 hours is more than adequate. And you'll check for the seal. And you do that by pressing down on the center of the lids, and it shouldn't move. It should be solid, not flexible anymore. If the lid is not solid, it flexes, then that jar you could put in the refrigerator and use it, or you could reprocess for the full amount of time with a new lid. Most of us would probably just put it in the refrigerator and use it. We recommend removing the jar rings. First of all, you want to clean the jars off after they've come out and cooled. And secondly, you can use the rings for other jars, and they tend to rust if you leave them on. You want to store all your canned goods in a cool, dry, dark place. And the recommendation is to use them between 1 year and 18 months. The flat lids today are designed, and the manufacturer feels will maintain their seal for at least 18 months. So 1 year to 18 months. To give you an example of some processing times, these are for tomato-only products. Nothing else is added, only the tomato. So in a boiling water bath, crushed tomatoes, a quart takes 45 minutes. So make sure you have your laptop device or your book or TV handy, because you can't leave the kitchen, and it takes 45 minutes to process crushed tomatoes. Whole or half tomatoes, the process time depends on what you pack them in. So if in water, so you take your whole or your half tomatoes and you just add more boiling water to fill the space, it's 45 minutes. And you can see in these cases, sometimes the pints are left. So here it would be 40 minutes for pints. If you have no added liquid, you put your tomatoes in, pack them in fully, no extra liquid, quarts or pints, 85 minutes in the canner. So it's almost an hour and a half. Same with if you added tomato juice rather than water with the tomatoes. It's 85 minutes for pints and quarts. Tomato juice by itself, it's 40 minutes for quarts, 35 for pints. Unseasoned tomato sauce, you cook down your sauce of just tomatoes. Process time is 40 minutes, pints 35. In the case of tomato sauce, we'll talk about this, but if you added tomatoes and, you added peppers and onions, that's a seasoned product, plus it has low acid vegetables. It's no longer able to be done in a boiling water bath. It has to be done in a pressure canner. Some of these products, if you read our resources, a few of these can be done in pressure canners instead of a boiling water bath. The processing time is somewhat shorter for many of those. However, you do have time, as you'll see, to get the canner to pressure and then let it cool down. So overall, it's probably pretty much the same. Pressure canners are different. I encourage you to, when we get it up there soon, view our video on pressure canning. Look at and read about pressure canning for more details, but a pressure canner either has a weighted gauge. I think you can see my cursor. This is a weighted gauge canner, and this is a dial gauge canner. Dial gauge, they both work very well. Dial gauge are only as accurate as that dial, so that be sure that the dial is accurate. It allows the canner to reach a much higher level of temperature and prevents the growth of botulism in the final product. So that is what we're, not botulism, but the bacteria that causes botulism. So we use the pressure canner for low acid foods and those mixed foods. You'll only have a couple of inches of water in the bottom of the canner. You're going to read the directions for your canner. That's simmering water. Again, the product goes on the racks. You put the lids on the canner and you bring it up to pressure. First, you let steam escape for a full 10 minutes once you see it, and then you close the vent or the petcock. And then once the correct pressure is reached on a dial, you'll read for the number, which might be 10 pounds of pressure. On a weighted gauge canner, the weight rocks, it makes a jiggling sound. And when it's at that steady rocking, that's when the pressure is where it needs to be. Again, altitude is adjusted for if needed. Whoops, sorry. And then once that pressure is there, then you start the processing time. It can be, again, probably 35 minutes or more. Once the processing time is done, you would turn the heat off and let the canner cool naturally. That's going to take a while because you'll have quite a few jars in the canner. And once the pressure is at 0, then you would open the canner. You would do those same things that you do for the boiling water bath. There are some safety pieces built in here. You wait a couple minutes after the pressure is at 0 just to make sure there's no pressure in there. Remove the weight or open the petcock, which allows any steam in there to escape. Again, wait 10 minutes. These are safety measures so that you don't get burned. It also, they calculate that when they do the time. So you don't want to shortchange any of these steps. Watch for the steam as you open the canner. You can see here the jars are put on a padded surface. Same thing as the boiling water canner, 12 to 24 hours. And check the jars are sealed. Once, the other thing, of course, is you're going to label and date all your jars so that you know what is in them and when you put those in there. So in summary, tomatoes are delicious and healthy. They're very easy to preserve, the easiest of which is freezing. Dehydrating is also easy. It does intensify the flavor. It takes up little space in your cabinet, or if you wanted to freeze it in your freezer. And canning, our key messages for canning are always use a tested recipe from a reliable source. Truly, I would skip the internet unless it's the internet to your cooperative extension service. Follow the directions exactly, no changing anything. And make sure you follow the correct processing time for the size of the jars, and in some cases, the altitude. So now we're going to skip into salsa. And salsa is certainly one of those foods that has just grown in popularity over the last few years. So it is a pickled product. We're going to walk you through the canning process for canning a tomato pepper salsa. And this one uses slicing tomatoes, not the plum tomatoes. And the recipe comes from So Easy to Preserve. That is the manual recipes and all sorts of directions from the University of Georgia, which you can purchase. It's about $18 and has everything in it you need. But much of the information that's in there is also available on their website. I do want to mention another recent research study that was done in 2019 by some colleagues from Maine in Extension. And they looked at those blog posts, and they specifically looked at blogs on home canning salsa. And they reviewed 43 blogs with 56 posts. And what they found was that the majority of the guidelines or recipes in the food blogs, 70% across all the components they looked at, had some serious concerns in terms of accuracy. So one of the biggest concerns was that the majority of the salsas from these blogs were insufficiently acidified, and that was 91%. So almost every recipe didn't have enough acid in them to process in a boiling water bath, which is what we recommend salsas to be in. So it's so important to follow a good recipe. Okay, so the resources is this University of Georgia site. We'll come back to that later. So just as I said before, this is a different canner. This one has a metal lid. I will say what I like about the glass lids is you can watch the water boiling without peaking, and keeping the lid on the canner keeps the boil easier. It gets it up to a boil quicker and keeps less steam in the kitchen. Same thing as before. Prepare your jars. Here, salsas are generally done in pint jars, 2-cup jars. If the recipe is for pint jars, you can't go, you know what? We eat a lot of salsa. I'm going to put it in a quart jar. Can't do that. It wasn't tested for quart jars. It may be unsafe. So use the jar that it says. I know we asked, well, could you use those cute little 4-ounce jars for salsa or gifting? And the answer was no, we didn't test that. And also probably the product would be overcooked because it would be in the canner too long in such a small jar. So most of them are going to use the 2-cup jars, pint jars. Everything we said before, as you would with any canning, the jars need to be cleaned and washed. Having extra water on hand is good. All your ingredients. Now, tomatoes, this recipe used slicing tomatoes. Some recipes might call for plum tomatoes. Use what it says. Some recipes might allow you to have half tomatoes and half tomatillos, which are similar to tomatoes, but a little bit different, and they would have a different density. So if it doesn't say you can add tomatillos, you may not. Peppers often it'll say whether you should be using sweet bell peppers or whether you can use hot peppers, and generally you can use any hot peppers you prefer. So here you see pictured the jalapenos and the Anaheims, but if you had, you know, chili peppers or the habaneros, you could use those too. Onion, vinegar. This is a pickle product, and you must use a vinegar that is 5% acidity. It says it right on the outside of the container. Do not use any specialty herbal vinegars that you might have around the house. Either use a white vinegar, which is a more sharper taste, or apple cider vinegar, which is kind of pictured here. It's a softer taste, but both of those need to be 5% acidity, and that's what you would buy in the store. You'd want to use pickling or canning salt, not table salt. Most table salt has additives. It may also have iodine, and those things tend to make in the case of pickles with a brine, cloudy, but your canning salt is pure. Kosher salt, read the label, but most kosher salt has no additives in it, so that's good. You could use that instead. You may have garlic. There may be some other seasonings in there, but you're going to follow the directions in the recipe. You can't start adding, you know, if the recipe says add 3 peppers for half a cup, and I go, I love this really hot, I'm going to add a cup of peppers. You can't do that because it changes the acidity of that product, and they didn't test for it that way. And then the product may not be safe. So always measure accurately. Sometimes the recipes ask you to weigh the product. If you have a small scale, actually, I just bought a kitchen scale not too long ago because I didn't have one. And it's handy, and they've become very reasonably priced and nice and small because I don't have a lot of storage. You want to prepare your tomatoes. We talked about that before with the freezing, but here to get the skins off, you're going to wash the tomatoes, cut an X in the base or the blossom end of the tomato, and then you're going to dip those tomatoes in boiling water for 30 to 60 seconds. Sometimes they need a little longer, it depends on the tomato, just until the skin starts to split. Then immediately take them out, and you want to do small batches at a time for this. Dip them into cold or ice water, and that'll cool them off and stop the cooking process. And then you'll be able to slide the skins of the tomatoes off and core them. Then you're going to chop them into small pieces, which you see here. You probably don't want the skins on for the salsa. In the canning process, all the skin's going to peel off, and you'll have these tough pieces of skin and then the tomatoes. So while in a fresh salsa, you might leave the skins on, it doesn't work well in canning. Peppers, just a couple tips here. Again, washing them, cut the peppers lengthwise. You can remove the stems and the white membranes and the seeds. You could do it with a knife. I've also used like a melon baller that I've had. That works pretty well. But what you see here is they have their plastic gloves on. It's really a good idea to wear plastic or rubber gloves, unless you're just cutting up one pepper. That capsaicin, that is the compound that gives the peppers their heat, gets into your hands, and it is impossible to get that off quickly, and your hands will be on fire. So it's hard to get that away. Washing it won't do it. Mostly it's time. And trust me when I say I had the bad experience of cutting up many hot pepper for an event, and my gloves had holes in them, and I think it was 6 hours before I could finally have normal hands. It was not pleasant. Cut the peppers into small pieces and measure or weigh out the amount that's here. Another caution when you're cutting all these peppers, sometimes the peppers, call it spit, the water can shoot So it might be good to wear glasses. Again, you don't want that liquid to get into your eyes. Onions, do what you would normally do, you know, small pieces, garlic press, or very finely mince your garlic and measure out accurately. So salsa is what we call hot pack, which means that the food is heated until it's usually boiled and heated for a certain amount of time. And then it's put into the jars hot. It's not packed in cold. It's heated, and you need to follow that. You can't go, I don't have time. I'm just going to put it in the jars and it's going to go in the water bath anyway. That does not work, because when they test these recipes, they started with a hot product, and that's how the final time was established. So you just bring it into all your ingredients in the sauce pot, get to the boil, and then whatever the recipe says, in this recipe they used, it was 20 minutes of simmering, stirring occasionally. When you're ready to fill the jars, your jars need, if they're going to have hot pack like they are here, the jars should be warm. Easiest way either to have them in the canner that's going to be used later, or maybe they've just been run through the dishwasher and they're still warm, or leave them in your clean sink in some hot water. In any case, you want the jars to be warm, because cold jars, hot food could cause cracking. The jar funnel or filler helps keep the tops of the jars clean, less mess. 1/2-inch headspace, so the space from the food to the top edge of the jar is 1/2 inch. You would want to stir that with a plastic knife or a chopstick to make sure that the food is distributed well and there's no bubbles in there, and then adjust till you get to 1/2-inch headspace. And here they're using a ruler on the left to measure. You may want to measure the first jar, and after that you'll be able to eyeball it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it can't be, you can't have 1.5 inches of headspace. You won't have a good product. So use a ruler first if you like, and you can use the threads of the jar as a guide as well. Wipe the tops. You can see they're doing that there. If there's any food residue on the tops of your jars in canning, then the jar may not seal, and that would be a shame, because you've done a lot of work. Your lids are just washed and ready to put on top of the jars, and then you tighten those ring bands. Here it says tight, fingertip tight and snug. You don't want to use all your might to tighten the ring bands, because air has to come out of the jar lids to create the vacuum. So you just want it, once you get resistance, stop. You can see they're putting the jars into the canner, and that's the jar lifter. And you can see on the right, the jars are in the canner, but the water's still not, doesn't look like it's over the top of the jars. You're going to take that extra water you have and fill the space so that the water comes up to 1 to 2 inches over the top of the jars. On the right, you see there's some empty jars in there. So this person made 3 jars of salsa, and I do this myself. I take the empty space and put jars and let the hot water go into those jars. And that keeps, when the jars are boiling, they don't tip over, which is not good because it can interfere in sealing. So fill any empty space, and I would put 1 more in the center of that canner as well. Processing, same thing as the tomatoes, 1 to 2 inches over the tops of the jars. Put the lid on it, bring it to a full boil, and after it's boiled, keep the lid on, keep the steam in the pot, and start the clock when it comes to a full rolling boil. The water cannot stop. If it stops, then you got to start over from time 0. So we don't want to do that. We're going to stay in the kitchen and make sure that the pot stays boiling, but it's not boiling over onto the stove. Turn off, once the time is up, you turn off the burner, remove the lid. Again, there's a 5-minute wait. Then you remove the jars straight up and down. You don't want to tip them onto the board.
Next, let the jars sit undisturbed while they are cooling, which takes between 12 to 24 hours. If the jar seals properly, the lid will be curved inward and there will be a clear ringing sound when tapped. Finally, to store the jars, remove the bands from the sealed jars. Gently wash the lid area and threads of the jar in case there are any food or liquid residues that you might not see. Rinse and dry the jars, label and date them. Finally, store the jars without ring bands in a cool, dark, and dry place, and store unsealed jars in the refrigerator. Thank you so much for watching this presentation.